Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's presentation of the KSB Speaker Series. My name is Craig Swanson. I'm the president of Keep Sedona Beautiful, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Garry Neil. First, I want to do a little housekeeping. We have speaker series events scheduled for the next 3 months, after which we're going to take our customary summer break and then return with events starting in September. The Omicron surge now is on a significant downswing, and we're planning at this point to have our next 3 speaker series events live and in person in our meeting room at 360 Brewer Road. So hopefully that's going to happen. But we'll also simulcast the events on Zoom for those who are still not comfortable in person or are traveling or live somewhere else. Should circumstances require, though, we'll cancel the live portion of our events and just simulcast. Time will tell. Unless we notify you otherwise, attendees at our live events are going to need to show proof of vaccination and wear masks inside. We want to be careful with everybody's health, and that's the way we can do it. Our next speaker series presentation is going to be at 5 o'clock on Wednesday, March 16th. And it's going to be a panel discussion of residents and local officials on the subject of the OHV crisis in Sedona. In order to accommodate our speakers, the event will take place on the 3rd Wednesday of the month, as opposed to the usual 2nd Wednesday of the month. So March's event is going to be March 16th. The panelists at this will be Amy Tinderholt, the Red Rock District Ranger, Candace Carr-Strauss, Sedona Chamber of Commerce CEO, Deanna Bindley, a resident, Donna Michaels, Yavapai County Supervisor, Joanne Keene, the Sedona Deputy City Manager, and Rob Adams, resident and former mayor of Sedona. Panelists are going to have make short presentations on the OHV issue from their perspective, and then what we'll do is open the discussion up for questions from attendees. As most of you, I'm sure, know, OHV use in the Verde Valley is something that KSB is significantly concerned about, and we hope that this session that we have in the panel discussion and dialogue are going to help us move forward towards a solution. We expect a very lively evening, so join us. Then on Wednesday, April 13th, Nancy Steele, the Executive Director of Friends of the Verde River, is going to speak on water availability and quality here in the Verde Valley. On Wednesday, May 18th, Janine Trevelyan from Sedona Heritage Museum will talk about the past 50 years and how Sedona and KSB have evolved with the times. That's a timely presentation because May 17th, just 6 days later, is the anniversary of the incorporation of Keep Sedona Beautiful as a 501c nonprofit. And to celebrate, the Sedona Heritage Museum is going to be mounting an exhibit on our first 50 years. They'll be holding a reception in the afternoon of the 17th, and you're all invited to come to that and see the exhibit. Stay tuned for details, and KSB will be communicating those details well prior to the event. We hope to see you here at KSB on March 16th for a panel discussion on OHVs. With that, back to tonight's presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce Garry Neil. Garry has an academic background in lichen physiology and ecology, and retirement provided him the opportunity to delve a little further into lichen taxonomy and identification. Since 2015, at the request of Red Rock District wildlife biologist and frequent presenter at our speaker series events, Janie Agyagos, Garry's been working with the Forest Service doing an extensive survey of lichen species in our area. His presentation tonight will introduce you to the fascinating world of lichens and the critical role they play in the ecology of the Red Rock District. Please ask questions to Garry. You can do so by entering that any question you have into the Q&A feature of Zoom. It should be down at the bottom of your screen, so if you just bring your cursor down there. Q&A should come up and you should be able to type in a question. We'll address them at the end of Garry's presentation. And with that, I'll turn things over to Garry Neil.
Well, hello, everybody. Tonight's talk, as been mentioned, is going to be about lichens. A lot of people have heard of lichens, but a lot of people really don't know what they really are. So I thought we'd start out with that kind of introduction and then go on to some of the interesting things about lichens here in the Red Rock Ranger District, along with some of the more common lichens that you will probably see when you just walk on the trails, etc. This particular piece of bark from juniper was brought to me by Janie a couple of weeks ago. She goes around and picks up things and brings them in for me to identify and also record it, because the area is so large, 550,000 acres. I'm not going to cover the whole area unless I live about 40 more generations. Anyway, this particular lichen, looks red, okay, fine, everything. But if you look closely to it, this is what it looks like. You'll see that it has quite a few different little structures that normally you wouldn't see with the common eye. And that's why when you're looking at lichens, you need to have some kind of magnifying lens, et cetera, to really see their characteristics. Tonight, we'll discuss some of these characteristics so you'll become more familiar when you do observe lichens in the field. This particular sign is interesting. It was a photograph taken at Joshua Tree National Park. And the quote on the sign is at the bottom of the page. The interesting thing about it is that it talks about, here are lichens, but it's not really pointing to any lichens. So I'm not sure what the people are looking at to see what is a lichen or not. But the wording then, it is really important in the sense that lichens do live in a variety of climates, all the way from Antarctica and all the way up to high elevations to low elevations, right along seashores. In fact, some are even found on seaweed. Anyway, where do lichens really, where do they grow? Well, they can grow on almost anything. On rock, soil, limestone, sandstone, on bark of various trees and shrubs, on exposed wood. So in other words, not just the bark, but if you peel the bark back, sometimes some lichens of some species will grow on that. They can actually grow on glass. They grow on leaves. In fact, the person I work with at ASU, Frank Bunsgaards, he was a lichenologist that started out in the Galapagos Islands for the Darwin Research Institute before taking a job at ASU. And he has a photograph of lichens actually growing on the carapace of tortoises or the shell. So like I said, they'll grow on almost anything. First of all, what isn't a lichen? Well, it's not going to be a flowering plant. It's not going to be bulrush. It's not going to be a fern. It's not going to be a gymnosperm. And it's not going to be mosses. A lot of people think when they see a moss, they're seeing lichens, but in fact, they're not. And also liverworts. And then by itself, lichens are not just a fungus. They're not just what they call an ascomycete or a cup fungus, or what they call a club fungus, which is a basidiomycete, mushrooms which you buy and eat. And they're not just an algae, and they're not just a cyanobacterium. You may not know what cyanobacteria or the term, but another term for it is blue-green algae. And the reason why they call it cyanobacteria is because this particular type of organism doesn't have a nucleus. Anyway, so what is a lichen? It's a lichen that's a combination of one of two fungi, either an ascomycete or a cup fungus or a basidiomycete. Along with that, it then combines with the majority, a green algae or a cyanobacterium. In some cases, that the fungus can be also associated with both. But the majority of lichens are composed of cup fungi along with green algae. Very few are fungi that are mushrooms or just cyanobacteria. Again, cyanobacteria, though, with fungi can grow together to form a fungus, form a lichen, and that represents about 10% of the population. And these particular, when it is this particular fungus and this particular algae, the majority of those lichens are very slimy when they're wet, or they're called gelatinous. But the first mentioning of lichens occurred with Linnaeus. I won't try to pronounce the Latin, but what he called them is poor peasants among the plants. So for many, many years, and the lichens that were collected back in the 1600s, 1700s, et cetera, were considered to be plants as such, but now things have separated because there isn't just two kingdoms anymore. There isn't animals and plants. There is now fungi as another kingdom, et cetera. All right, so what exactly is a lichen? Well, first of all, it's a symbiotic relationship. There's a fungus and an algae, and they're growing together. And most of the cases, they're mutual. In other words, one gets something from the other. And this case, the majority of cases, it's either the green algae or the cyanobacterium that's living with the fungus, and it's the algae or the cyanobacterium is producing carbohydrates. Lichens, on the other hand, is producing a protection covering for the lichens. It also holds water to maintain moisture for a longer period of time. And also it cuts back on the sun rays penetrating into the algae and harming them. So anyway, those are the two. The symbiotic relationship then is totally a mutual agreement in most cases. So anyway, the lichen, the fungus, et cetera, lichens are composed again of two biological kingdoms. The algae, or is a plant, is a plant. The fungus, of course, is the fungi itself, but cyanobacteria belongs to another kingdom called Monera. And the Monera kingdom are those that do not have any nuclei, but they do have chlorophyll, and so they can photosynthesize. So again, it's always a fungus, and it's either going to be a green alga, or it's going to be a cyanobacterium, or in some cases, it can be both. Lichens are also, the names of the scientific names of lichens are based on their fungal component. So when you identify lichens, or when a new lichen is identified, the scientific name that's given to it is a fungal name. It's not based on the algae or the cyanobacterium. And the reason for that is that the algae that are in the lichens, there's only a few genera that exist in lichens. And with cyanobacterium, the same thing. So in that case, if you had been named after an algae or a cyanobacterium, you would always have the genus in the majority of lichens as the name. So again, that's why the fungal component is what's used for the naming of lichens. Again, the lichens are placed in the kingdom fungi. The oldest known fossil that has been found so far is back about 400 million years. It's one of the first organisms that were found on land, at least at that period of time. There was a survey done in 2016, and at that time, there was 5,421 total species in 733 genera, et cetera, that were just recorded just in North America and Mexico and Canada. In 2010, 969 species of lichenized fungi have been found in the state of Arizona. And that represents about 20% of all the species reported in the continental United States and Canada. There hasn't been a survey of the entire state of Arizona anytime after that time. Right now, though, the 2010 survey went over for a number of years with a number of lichenologists, and they ended up with a publication in 3 volumes of the lichens that were collected and identified in Arizona during that time period. All right, the largest number of lichenized fungi, again, are the Ascomycetes. Here you had the cup fungi. Here is an ascomycete. This is called a wolf lichen. It's found in high elevation areas, and it's a toxin. It produces a toxin that the Native Americans use as a poison in their hunting. It's called the wolf lichen, and the scientific name is Vulparia. There is a low number again of lichenized fungi or basidiomycetes, or again mushrooms along with the algae. And there's one shown here on the right bottom that is one of those. We have no, as far as I know, or haven't found anyway, any basidiomycete type lichens. I mentioned that sometimes the green algae and the cyanobacterium could be found on the same lichen. Here's a lichen. It's found right here in our area. And it's, in this case, it's a green algae. That's the coloration, of course, that you're seeing here. And these little black dots are called cephalodia. And cephalodia are nothing but blue-green algae growing and causing these little pustules. And so in this case, this particular lichen actually has two different algal components and also a fungal component. Okay, we said it's a symbiotic relationship. Another thing you should know that lichens play a significant role in nitrogen fixation. About 10% of the lichen species are capable of changing the gas nitrogen to NH3, which can be used by plants. Those lichens all contain blue-green algae or cyanobacterium. It's only cyanobacterium that can fix nitrogen. It's not the fungus that fixes the nitrogen, it's the cyanobacterium. Green algae don't have that particular capability. Okay, and the vast majority of lichens also produce their own carbon source because they're photosynthetic, and therefore the majority of lichens are not parasitic. However, there are some, and there will be one I'll show you tonight, that is parasitic on other lichens. Another issue that we can find out about is that we have found that mineral nutrients can be extracted from the substrate of the lichen that is growing, but has no harm to the living organism where they live. So there's a lot of substances that are and acids that are produced by lichens, but right now we don't see any restriction on its impact and on their organisms. You don't want to chew on a lichen though, the majority are bitter. Okay, lichens can, another thing about lichens is that if you took the fungus and you took the algae and separated them out, they probably couldn't grow in the habitat where they grow now. The combination of two allows them to be in some places where individual, if you separate the two components out, they wouldn't be able to live together. Live in those particular areas. Green algae, the green alga type lichens can survive with just the uptake of water vapor. It doesn't have to be raining out there for it to survive all the time. However, it does metabolize a lot longer when it does rain, etc. When it's on water vapor, it does cut down on its metabolism. However, cyanobacteria do require liquid water in order to metabolize with the fungus. In this particular case, that's why the cyanobacterium or the cyanobacteria lichens are always going to be very gelatinous, because when they are wet, their whole tissue expands and becomes spongy and very gelatinous. Here's an example of two lichens. The one on the right is, again, a green alga lichen, whereas the one on the left is a cyanobacteria lichen. You can very tell the color. Cyanobacterium, even though it's kind of a bluish green, when it's in large populations, it looks almost black in some cases. The little circles here you see on this particular lichen, by the way, is what we call a fruiting body, and we'll be talking about that in a minute. Okay, cyanobacteria versus green algae. Here's the top layer of a lichen is called the cortex. And it's the same both for cyanobacteria lichens as it is for green alga lichens. Underneath that, there is going to be the algae itself or the cyanobacteria. In this case, the cyanobacteria is underneath the cortex, whereas in this case, the green algae is also in the cortex, but then there's another layer below it that is the same type of fungal tissue as the cortex. So it almost play kind of a sandwich type situation. And that's called the medulla, which is below the algal layer. And then there's a lower cortex. In cyanobacteria, there is no lower cortex, only an upper cortex, which is kind of a protective shield. On the bottom, there'll be just the kind of tissue, fungal tissue, and sometimes you'll see tiny little white hairs on the bottom of the cyanobacteria lichens, and that's called tomentum. It's like a powdery substance. Again, here's one interesting thing. Here's the same genus, Peltigera neopactydactyla and Peltigera leucophilia, excuse me, I'm sorry. Anyway, again, they're the same genus. However, in this case, the genus is composed of two remotely different lichens in the sense that this one has cyanobacterium and this one has green algae. Both of these grow in our area. And if you go, for example, to the Long Canyon Trail and you hike into the wilderness area, you'll go through a pinyon juniper area, then all of a sudden you'll keep walking, all of a sudden there'll be a stand of manzanita, and you'll see a soil bank, and it's going to be on your left side as you walk into that wilderness area. And if you look down closely into that soil is moist a lot for a considerable amount of time before it dries out during the summer. And you'll find Peltigera type lichens in that area. It's one of the most common areas to find it. Okay, the general structure of a lichen, though, let's go back to ones with green algae, because there's a lot of similarity to a leaf. The upper cortex, again, is the upper layer of a lichen. Then you go into the algal layer, and this is stained, by the way. It's a microsection. And then underneath that, there is loose fungal materia, and that's called the medulla. And then below that is the lower cortex. And then coming out of it, there'll be little root-like structures that they're called rhizines. The interesting thing about this, if you take a leaf and you make a cross-section of a leaf, you have an upper cortex. You then have the chlorophyll area, the cells that contain chlorophyll. They're not algae. And then you have the spongy layer of the leaf, which is, again, the same type of tissue that's in the cortex, but it's more loosely arranged. And then you have a lower cortex. So it's very interesting to see that in this case, it's almost a mimic of a leaf in cross-section for the typical green algae lichens. Okay, the lichen body itself is called a thallus. That is the body of the lichen. That's called a thallus. And then the lichens are they're separated by their growth forms. The first growth form is called crustose, and we're going to go through examples of all of these. Another type of growth form is called squamulose, and they look like little pads or scales, and a lot of times they're overlapping, and the edges of the squamules are usually uplifted. Then there's sterile crustose. Sterile crustose don't have what's called fruiting bodies, which we'll get to in a minute, and they're another type of thallus. The other one is called fruticose, and they're shrubby lichens. They look like tiny little shrubs. So that's another form of growth. And then there's leafy foliose lichens. The Peltigeras you just saw, those are foliose lichens because they look like leaves, because they're flat and they're broad. So in this case, those are foliose lichens. So anytime you see a lichen with a broad thallus, That's going to be a foliose lichen. And then finally, there's umbilicate lichens, and they look, and we'll see an example of that. Umbilicate lichens, they're attached to the substrate by only one point, and usually it's in the middle. And so in this case, the lichen itself, the thallus, looks like an umbrella that's standing up away from the rock usually, and it's attached by just one stalk that's attached to the substrate. And those are called umbilicate lichens. Okay. Now, usually the thallus is attached to substrate. It could be rock, bark, cement, anything you can think of that it can attach to it will. However, there are some, again, that have the crustose lichens that are squamulose looking. In other words, not the whole thing is attached, just the majority, but not the edges. And some species of these, some of these things, some of these crustose lichens are actually, you can't see the thallus because the thallus is actually in the rock surface or in the bark itself. So you can't even see the thallus. In that case, they're called endolithic lichens because endo means internal. And we're going to talk more about that in a while. Crustolichens do have an upper cortex, they have an algal layer, they have a medulla, but they have no cortex. Here's an example, by the way. This is Acrospora or Acrospora socialis. If you take a look on the side of the cliff face here, and you see all that yellow on the cliff face, that is most probably this particular genus, Acrospora. And how they hold themselves onto the rock is through filamentous hyphae or filamentous fungal filaments that penetrate into the substrate and hold themselves tightly to the rock. In fact, you have to wet them almost to really remove them. You have to be very careful because they could easily tear, etc. Okay, squamulose lichens, which I mentioned before, they're intermediates between a crustose and a foliose lichen. In other words, they're tiny, they're like little tiny pads, but they do have breadth to their width. And so they could be considered foliose, but they'd be minute foliose, if you want to call them that. They're usually composed of a few hundred to small scales, 1 to 15 millimeters in diameter. Excuse me, let me go back. Anyway, let me go back if I can. Let's see here. I'm gonna go back. Oh, that's going forward. Oh, here we go. Here we go. All right. Usually their base morphology, like I said, or the shape is a foliose type. This is squamulous again. And because they're a small size and stature, they're usually grouped with the crustose lichens. And that's the only reason. But now we're finding more and more lichenologists separating them out of squamulose and not being crustose. Okay, sterile lichens. They have no fruiting bodies. However, what they do have on their thallus is millions of spores. If you go to West Fork and hike the trails going along the Oak Creek there, you'll find greenish powdery lichens on the side of rocks, always in shade. And if you go up to them and you look at it and you put your finger and rub it, you'll get all kinds of powder onto your fingers. And those are sterile crustose. And in that particular case, like the stuff that's now on your fingers are spores. And the spores are composed of both the algae and the fungus. And they're totally wrapped around each other. And we'll show an example of that in a minute. Okay, shrubby lichens. Shrubby lichens are the ones that they look just like shrubs in the sense that they are just long thread filaments, and there are countless of them. There's branches, etc. And the most common shrubby lichen we have around here is called Usnea, and you only find that above 4,500 feet. an elevation. So if you're, again, on the West Fork and walking on that trail, as you go up and climb, you'll find them, you'll see them growing on various trees, and they'll be hanging down, and they look very shrubby. And if the one thing about Usnea, it's the only lichen that the little threads here, if you wet it, and then if you pull the filament apart, you'll find a white cord in the middle. And that white cord in the middle is only found in the genus Usnea. It's not found in any other lichen that I know of anyway, or anybody else. So in this case, if you ever see this shrubby lichen, go up there, just wet it with saliva or whatever, or a little bit of water, and then just take one of these filaments and pull it apart. And if you see this little white cord sticking out in the middle, you have discovered the genera or the genus Usnea. Okay. The center, like I said, the thallus is hollow in the middle and is filled with the fungus and or filaments, and it forms this cord. Okay, let's move on. Another good species that's a lot of fun to find is Cladonia. Cladonia has two different life forms. It has a squamule or a little pad on the bottom, and then growing out of it, they form these stalks. The stalks are called podicia, but that doesn't matter, just call them stalks. Anyway, they're called cup fungi because the majority of Cladonia form these little cup structures. And here, where you see this red material, those are fruiting bodies of this particular Cladonia deformis. These can grow to about 3 or 4 millimeters in height, and they're very visible, usually on soil, but you can find them on bark, and you can find them on rock if there's soil that's covering the rock a little bit. But otherwise, normally it's going to be in soil and bark is where you normally will find these. Usually they're in shaded areas and also in areas that are moist. You can find them in very dry areas, but in that case, what they do is dehydrate immediately, and they just go into suspension until such time they're wetted again, and then they'll start to metabolize. But again, it's a wonderful lichen to look at. It's one of the prettiest lichens out there, and there's boatloads of species of this particular genus. Foliose lichens look like leaves. Again, they're the largest lichens. They're leaf-like. They're composed of lobes. They're loosely attached to their substrate normally. This one's Loberia pulmonaria, and it's growing off a branch of a conifer. And it's held by these little root-like structures that are on the bottom side of the lichen called rhizines, and that kind of holds them in place. These lobes have an upper and lower side. The interesting thing about Loberia, if you ever heard of the doctrine of signatures in the 1600s, 1500s, physicians thought the shape of a plant is what would cure the illness of the person that mimicked or had a shape like that. For example, kidney beans might have been thought to cure kidney disease. In this case, Loberia pulmonaria, the reason why pulmonaria is the name is because it looks like lung tissue. And back in the 1700s, the doctors used to recommend people chew this to cure various lung diseases. I wouldn't have done that. It is bitter as ever. It's horrible. But anyway, these are foliose lichens. Now, here's the one I was talking about where the lichen is attached at only one point. And this is called the umbilicate lichens. Here's the upper surface of the lichen. This is the lower surface. And on the lower surface is one point. You'll find these usually underneath overhangs of sandstone rock. If you go by stream beds or even into dry areas and you look underneath or in cavities underneath overhangs of rock, you can find these particular type of lichens. Next are your jelly lichens. Again, jelly lichens are composed of the blue-green algae or the cyanobacterium. They're gelatinous when wet. And there are two genera of the particular jelly lichens. There is the Colema and the let's see, Lotogium. Anyway, but the point is that, again, these are very common. They're also very common on soil that we'll talk about in a minute. All right, the colors of lichens. The lichens have the color from the various pigments they have in their tissue. When they're wet, the coloration comes out more. And what happens, what you're seeing is the coloration is usually within the lichen itself. And so the cortex, once it gets wet, it becomes transparent and you can see the coloration more vivid than when they're dry. The pigments are made out of acid, various types of acids that are produced by the lichens. Other ones are xanthothones and anthraquinones. There are various types of acids, and usually they produce these type of colors. Again, here's Lotharia, which is wolf lichen, and here's a Caloplaca, which is very common in our area. All kinds of, there's all number of species of this particular genus, and they grow on rock, soil, and bark. So they're prolific. All right, now reproduction. How do they reproduce? They can reproduce by fragmentation, by parts of the lichen breaking off, or they can be produced by little structures called isidia. They're little columns, tiny microscopic columns. And inside there's spores, and the spores have algae and the fungus attached to each other. If another one is called, if they're not column, and the other one is called, there are pustules, little swellings on the surface of the lichen, and they're called ceridia. And the ceridia originate goes deep into the algal layer, and what happens, it forms a crack or pore, and they get entangled with the fungus, and when they're released, they have both components to start a new lichen. The same with the isidia. Again, the differences between one is columnar and the other one is a pustule type. And here's examples. Here is ceridia. It's gray, it's granular, and it's on the surface. It's like it breaks through the thallus, the cortex, upper cortex of the lichen. Here's isidia. You'll notice they're little tiny dots. They look like dots, but they're raised off of the surface like tiny columns. And then finally here, this particular lichen actually produces little leaflet type structures. And these are propagles, which will break off and they can form a new lichen if they land in the right place. So again, here is how they look like in monogram. This is, you'll see that here's the hyphal or the fungi, and it's wrapped around a algal cell. And so again, when the ceridia or isidia release these particular structures, they are carrying both components of the lichen. Here's an example of isidia. You'll notice again, these are columnar, they stick out. Sometimes they're colored at the tips, and sometimes they're growing along the margin of a lichen, and sometimes you'll see them growing onto the upper surface. That's called laminal, and they form these particular spore-producing structures that then can be released. Okay, sexually, how do they reproduce? Lichens have two types of structures, or can have two types of structures. One are called apothecia, which you'll find on the upper surface of the lichen. And the other one is called parathecia, which will be found enclosed in a capsule inside of the lichen. So you'll either be internal to the lichen or external to the lichen. And the only reason why it's called sexual, is because the spores in this case only have half of the chromosomes, and they have to form, they have to reproduce and mate with another spore in some cases, but they're called this. Now, in sexual reproduction, this is a cup fungus, and this is just a diagram. And there are two types. There are types where there's green algae on the edges of the cup, and there are others with no green algae on the side, and there are others that do have green. And they have it, so they have a margin, and some have a margin and some don't. And this is more than you really need to know, but the reason why I'm bringing it up is because you'll see in a minute is how they're shown. All right, so here's apothecia. Here is an apothecia. Notice it's around. It's always round. It's usually on some kind of little elevated above the thallus, but sometimes it's right sessile to the thallus itself. In other cases, it might be sunken in a little bit in the tissue of the lichen. But again, if you do cross sections, it'll look something like this. Here is the spores in the what's called the asci, and then here's the structure of the cup itself in this particular lichen. The spores are minute. These are spores of one lichen. They range from anywhere from one to about 100 in a tiny microscopic sac. And each genus has a specific number per sac that has these spores in it. And the spores can be just a simple ellipsoid type or globose type spore, or they can have cross walls, etc. The size of these particular spores, I can tell you right now, the distance between each one of these lines is 1 micron. And 1 micron is 0.0000001 millimeters. It's a thousandth of a millimeter. Okay, other types of apothecia. There are some apothecia that look like lines or scripts. And you'll see some lichens that have these black lines growing on the top of it. And that is their reproductive structure. Others, they have little stalks, and they have all the spores and everything are on the top of the stalk. And these are called pincushions. They're very, very minute. Okay, now going back to the perithecium, the cup type, again, there's a little opening. Here's the upper cortex of the lichen. Here's a little opening called the ostiole, and then here's the chamber. And in the chamber, you have fungal hairs in there, along with the spores, and the spores are in a sac called the ascus. And again, that's what the structure looks like for perithecium in that case. Okay, so let's go back to the fruiting body. In this particular case, again, we're going to talk about the umbilicate one, the one that only is attached by one point. You see these little black dots. These little black dots is what this is right here. You're seeing this. So if I make a section through one of these black dots, this is what you'll see inside. Here are the spores. This is the ostiole. And eventually this ostiole will open up and these spores will be released. So in this case, this is a perithecal type lichen. Now, spores come in a variety of shapes, sizes, and colors. They could be like single cells. They could have maybe one just cross wall. It's called one septate. Here's another one. They could be brown. They could be clear. They could be green. And then these other ones here could be multicellular. In other words, they don't have just cross walls, but they also have longitudinal walls. And these are called muriform spores. So again, spores come in different types and shapes, different colors, different sizes. You have to, when you try to identify a lichen, you actually have to measure the width and the length of them, the number of cross walls, etc., all have to be involved in identifying lichens. Here's one example. This is This is an example of Buellia, genus Buellia. In this case, here's the thallus, and then you see these black rounded structures. In this case, this rounded structure is an apothecia, and if we make a cross section through it, this is what you'll see. This particular genus, all of the species in this genus have brown spores, and they can be anywhere from one septate up to multiple cross walls and longitudinal walls in the structure. All right, let's digress a little bit. We should talk a little bit about lichen substances. Colors and dyes have been used for centuries with lichens. In fact, the Native Americans used to make dyes out of the lichens, and usually they use urine to extract the dyes from the lichens, and then they could form their color, different colors that they wanted to use to dye their wool, etc. It's also been used in perfumes, and it's been found in some cases to be pharmaceutical. Usnea, the stringy one that you saw earlier, it produces usnic acid. And in Europe, usnic acid is used as a pharmaceutical. Supposedly, it's supposed to relieve fevers. So far, I don't think it's sold in the United States as a pharmaceutical, but it is in Europe. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about lichens and where they grow. Here's a rock, and this is the same rock. This is taken on one side, this is taken on the other. You'll notice that the lichen population here is almost minute, whereas on this side, this particular boulder, same boulder, has all kinds of growth on it. Why? Well, the answer is this is south facing, this is north facing. You probably heard about mosses always grow on the north side of a tree. Well, lichens, in some cases, some species, they're not as tolerant also of having sun beating down on them, so they grow on more shaded areas. In this case, when it's an exposed boulder, they're growing on the most shaded side, which is going to be the south side versus the north side. All right, so now I think the next thing we need to talk about, because it's really important, is that stay on the trail. Biological soil crust is very, very important. And biological soil crust is composed not just of lichens, it's composed of algae, it's composed of microfungi, it's composed of mosses, it's composed of liverworts, and they're all growing within or on top of the soil here in our area. And what's important about it is that these particular organisms fix nitrogen, they stabilize the soil, they produce nutrients so that higher plants can finally grow. The area in Sedona has a very unique type of soil crust. You'll notice that when you go hiking, that off the trail, the soil is kind of built up into columns. This is called pinnacle soil. And pinnacle soil can be decimated by just stepping on it. And it takes over 100 years to reform. So when you see social trails or bicycles going off the trail or any other vehicle going off the trail, you're destroying something that takes 100 years to reform. Now, here are some of the lichens that are found on soil. Here we have Crospora. Here you have Placidium, which is a blue-green. Here you have, again, the Cladonia I talked about. Here's another Cladonia, here's another Cladonia. And here is a very unusual lichen, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's called Diploschistus, that also grows in soil. Others that grow in soil, here is Peltigera, we talked about that earlier. There's these little cup-like structures that are buried into the soil or immersed in it, and a petula. Another type of foliose lichen is Fisconia. And then you have these particular type of squamulose lichens that you'll find on soil. They're belong to the genus Sora, and they're very common. If you look down the soil and you see these little white little pads, most probably it's Sora. And there's one green one that also grows on soil, and it is also Sora. And if you go on Hermit Trail, for example, you'll come across after rain and stuff, the pinnacles of the soil, and you'll see all this green growing around it. And that is this particular species. All right, again, the fruticose lichens. Here is again the what we call the beard lichen. It's fruticose, has a green alga. It's covered by various spines, but they're not true spines because they're not stiff. They won't sting you. They don't have the ascidia or ceridia. Here you see these little white pads. That's the apothecia or the fruiting bodies on this particular species. And they're most common in trees, and they dangle down. Some can be very long. There's some lichens can be, there's certain species of lichens that hang from tree limbs that are about 10 to 15 feet in length. Another lichen that you'll see mainly in higher elevations, about 4,500 feet or so, and growing mainly in riparian areas, is Ramalina. It's called a fan lichen. And they're small, but the reason why you can identify Ramalina is because they always form this fan-like structure. And at the end of the fan-like structures, that's where the reproductive or the apothecia are located. So they're on the margins. But that's a very common lichen. If you wet it, it's really a beautiful lichen. It gets into a nice light green color. Otherwise, it looks fairly gray. There's no ceridia or anything like that on it, just the apothecia. All right. This one you've probably seen a lot of shrubs that look yellow. And this is because it has a species or genus called Xantho Mendoza. And if you take a hand lens or something and get up close to this particular yellow lichen, you'll see this. Here's the apothecia, the reproductive structures, but also what you can find are little cup-like structures. And these little cup-like structures have ceridia in it. And so you have two different types of reproductive structures in here on the same lichen. And this is a very common lichen in our area. There is, you'll find it, if you find manzanita, you'll find there a little bit, but not as much because the bark is too smooth. But if you go into sagebrush or any kind of scrub type where the wood is very gnarly, etc., it's a great substrate for this particular species. And it grows in very xeric areas. In other words, it doesn't need a lot of water to exist. And it's abundant in this area. Okay, here's another one you may find. If you walk along the trail, you'll see pine trees mainly that will have growing on its trunk this kind of foliose lichen. And you can recognize it right away because you'll see little gray areas on the edges of this lichen. And this particular lichen is very, very common, and it's called Flavopunctilia ceritica, or the common name is speckled green shield lichens. And it's very, very common. You go anywhere on these trails and look at some of these pine trees, and you'll see just a large growths of these particular lichens on the bark. And that's Flavopunctilia. Okay, again, here's Sora again. These are close-ups of what you can see in the soil. I wanted to show a number of photos of this only because it's so common. And again, if you go take a look at it, be careful, don't step on the crust. You can look over and peer in at it if you want. But again, these are all the same genus. One way you can tell this is the same genus because the reproductive structure are little black ball-like structures that are found on the surface of the thallus. Here's one, it's smaller than this one. There's one in here, but real tiny. And then you can see them very well here in the green one. And those, again, it tells it right away that is Sora. All right, another common one, and this is all over the place. I call it the Sedona weed. This is a Xanthoparmelia. Xanthoparmelia, there's a number of species of this, and we have a number of species that grow on our area. They grow on rock, they can grow on bark, they can grow in soil, but the majority grow on rock. And you go anywhere and you'll see it. You walk up and you see green covering a rock, most probably is Xanthoparmelia. It's going to be adhering very closely to the rock, going to be hard to peel off. You can see reproductive structures on it and everything else. But again, they're called, the common name is shield lichens. They're very difficult to identify. And so because of that, the only way you can identify is by their chemistry. And so what you need to do, you take parts of the lichen and you dissolve it in acetone, and then you place them on these plates that are coated like with a flour-like coating. And then you run a solvent up this plate, and the various components or acids that are in that particular, the Xanthoparmelia will move up to different levels. And each one of these levels is indicating a different type of lichen acid that's being produced by Xanthoparmelia. And depending on what acids they are, that's how you identify the species. This is another photograph of the same thing using UV light because some of the substances do not show very well unless it's under UV light. It's one way to do it. You only can do it in a lab. You can't do it anywhere else. It has to have a hood because of the chemicals you're using are carcinogenic. Again, here's another example of it. Okay, so here's another Xanthoparmelia. This one going to have a very Isidia growing out of it. It looks very rough. The thallus is very crinkly and kind of convex and concave and everything else. But if you look closely, you see all these little structures standing out. And this particular species has this particular characteristic. And it also has apothecia. All right, here's more rock shields because since it's so prevalent, I wanted to point them out. Some have very large apothecia here. These are all three different genera. That's not a Xanthoparmelia, but that's a Lichens. But here's a Xanthoparmelia, here's another one. And they're all different types. They're all, the majority again, are growing mainly on sandstone, and you'll see them all over the place. And the common name again is called rock shield. Again, this is the dust lichen I talked about. You can find in West Fork. It's nothing but a bunch of spores. The thallus actually is nothing but spores. And it comes in various colors. It could become a yellowish, whatever. The most common one, though, is this type in our area. And again, if you take your finger and rub it across, you'll get, your finger will be all powdery. And those are the spores that are coming, they're Ceridia that you'll see in the Liparia. It has no apothecia or sexual reproductive structures at all. Here is a lichen that is, it's only the thallus. It's only the reproductive structure, the apothecia. The thallus is actually in the rock. It's what they call endolithic. So all you're seeing here are these little black dots, and they are the reproductive structures of this particular genus. This particular genus, if you slice into them, and the structure that holds the spores, there'll be over 100 spores in each structure. Here's an example of another endolithic. This is called Buccaria. This one has parathecia. Remember the cup type reproductive structure? So if you cut these in half or make sections of it, it will be a parathecia type. what you see here is a cross section of a rock. Here's the actual reproductive structure. And Frank Bunsgart, the professor of lichenology down at ASU, has put a stain into the rock. And this purple coloration here is actually indicating that is fungal growth that's occurring inside the rock. Here's another Eukarya. Again, all you see is the reproductive structures. Again, the perithecia are in these structures, but the actual fungus itself and the algae is in the soil. Okay, Peltigera rufescens, another common one you'll be able to find. Again, it's foliose. If the neat thing about this particular one, you can tell it from others because on the tips of the lobes, they are very powdery. And the point is that it's a good common denominator for this particular species. The reproductive structures in this case look like tiny saddles, and they're on the edge of the particular lichen, this foliose. And so in this case, the apothecia are brown. Again, it's a soil lichen. You'll find it in the soil. It can get very large. It can get to about almost about 3, 4, 5, 6, about 6 inches across in some cases. All right, here's another jelly lichen, Lichenella. This is found normally in seeps where water is seeping down rocks. And you take a look and you see it flowing over this black gelatinous mass of tissue. And that particular one is called rock licorice. And again, it's very slimy and gelatinous. And this particular lichen is only found really in very moist areas. Okay, there is another one you'll find growing on the side of cliffs. This is called Phaeophycea. What's neat about it, if you take a real close look at the end of the lobes, you'll see tiny little risings sticking out. And it's black and white. And it's a very characteristic of this particular lichen. But it's a foliose lichen. These are the lobes. This is growing down. And then you'll see all this little hair-like structures at the end. This is the one, Archospora socialis. All of you have seen this, if not close, from a distance, because all of this is this. In other words, what you're looking at here is probably over 1 million thalli, over 1 million squamules growing together. Here's another one. This is also a Acrospora. This is, you'll see this also in rock. If you take a close look at it, here's the reproductive structures, these little gray structures. Again, it grows just like the other one, yellow, but you don't see as much of a mass growing as you do on the yellow one I showed you before. But again, this is another one that is the same genus as the socialis that grows on cliff face. Again, another one is Caloplaca, very common. You'll find this growing mainly on bark and rock. They're very rust color looking. The characteristic of this particular genus is that the spore looks like it has a cross wall, but it doesn't really. It has a little canal right here. So it's not entirely closed. It's one of the few genera that has that typical type of spore that pretty well defines it being a Caloplaca type lichen. Another lichen is Diploschistus. I talked about this. The only reason why I'm bringing this up is that when it's young, it parasitizes Cladonia. It actually will grow over it and start taking minerals and nutrients from the Cladonia. But as it gets older, then it becomes self-sufficient. But this is called, you'll see it all. If you see Cladonia, look around the Cladonia and see if you find this white tissue. It looks like just a big foam, but it's solid. And you'll see all this apothecia in the thallus. Again, there's the the one with the stipple back, it's the one with the only the one attachment. And then it has this fan shape. And here's on the underside of this rock wall, and it's growing all over it. And so very characteristic of this is called dermatocarpon. And it's a foliose lichen. It's very leathery. It's very hard when it dries. If you ever want to take a sample of it, you have to slip a knife underneath it to cut the attachment. Otherwise, it just breaks. Okay, here's one of the smallest lichens you ever see. This is a pin lichen. This one's found on juniper. I found it totally by accident. I was looking at something else, and all of a sudden I seen these little tiny little structures. This is a reproductive structure right here, and it's loaded with spores all around it. And that's my presentation. Here are some resources for doing lichenology. If you ever want to deal with it, these are the books that are normally used. If you Google lichen text, you'll find a lot of these. Also, if you would like to get involved in doing this survey and like to assist in collecting lichens for the Red Rock Ranger District, you can email me. And I'd be more than happy to take you out, show you how to do it, how to collect. And even if you can't identify, if you can just go ahead and you know, go ahead and collect, and I can show you how to do that, what to collect. We can then identify it together, whatever. But if you'd like to get involved, please email me. Finally, I want to thank Janie Agyagos, Judy Kennedy as a FOF member that used to assist me quite a while. Frank Bumgartz is really my mentor. He's the PhD lichenologist specialist at ASU. He's the collection manager of the herbaria there. We're the 5th largest herbaria in the United States. I also have to thank my wife, who allows me to take over the dining room table and the garage during my research. And then finally, if anybody I failed to mention, I want to thank you also.
All right. Thank you very much, Garry. That was fascinating. And for those of you that may be interested in doing this kind of thing, Janie Agyagos, the wildlife biologist, has opportunities for citizen scientists to participate in studies like this. This isn't the only one. There's all sorts of things. So I would urge you, if you're interested in it, to visit the Friends of the Forest Sedona website and become a member of Friends of the Forest and join in on the citizen science projects that Janie runs. They're all fascinating. We got a lot of interesting questions, and one of them to start out with is wondering, do we know how many different uses Native Americans had in this area for lichens?
Well, we do know they used it for dyes. I'm not sure about for food, again, because they are extremely bitter. Now, other than that, they could be, maybe they used them for some medicinal purposes, but I really don't know. The only thing I really know is that they did use them for dyes.
Got it. Another question is there anything that lichens cannot break down? Can they metabolize plastic?
No, here, for example, the lichens that grow on these various substrates are probably not feeding off of that substrate, maybe for some minerals if it's there. But other than that, again, you have the algae that's giving the carbohydrates for the fungus. And the fungus in its part is protecting the algae either from direct sunlight and also holding a moisture inside for the algae can metabolize for a greater period of time. Lichens do dry out. And when they dry out, they just go into suspended animation. There's been cases where you can take a lichen that's been dried out for 4 or 5 months and wet it, and it'll start metabolizing. Of course, if you keep it dry long enough, it's not going to survive, and that'll be it. But they can last for a very, very long time in suspension without metabolizing at all. Once you wet them, they start to turn on and do their thing.
Kind of a following up on that, are there any lichens that grow underwater or in tide pool type areas?
Yes, there are.
Ah,
Yeah. I've never collected them myself, but there are that grow on, they're called maritime lichens. They grow on splash zones where tides come in. They grow in areas where, just salt water and everything splashes up on top of them. And but I'm not sure if I've ever heard of a lichen growing totally submerged in salt water 24/7.
got it. Question, besides being extremely bitter, are any lichens poisonous? And I have a little second part of that I had wanted to ask. Are the spores of any lichens dangerous to humans or other animals?
Well, if you're allergic to fungi, the
Ah,
spores can cause, it could cause allergy, an allergy reaction. Um, what was the other part of that question? I'm sorry, I missed.
oh, are there any that are poisonous?
Not that I know
Not,
of. Not that I know
ah,
of. There are,
okay.
animals do eat, do forage on them. Birds use them. In fact, if you go to bird nests, you can collect lichens out of bird nests because sometimes they use them in building their bird nests. I don't know of any lichens that are poisonous, but I'll tell you right now, if you bite into a lot of these lichens, you'll spit them out pretty quick.
A question about the black desert varnish we see on the cliffs around
Yes.
there. Do you know what that's made of? And
Yeah,
is it,
that's a lichen called Placinium, and it is a crustose lichen. It's very difficult to identify. In fact, the person that is the most knowledgeable about this particular genus is in Germany. In fact, Frank, the person I work with ASU, he sends them to this guy because he has a hard time identifying as well. But they are a lichen. It's a patina. It forms a patina. The one you can find easily, and you'll know what it is Placithium nigrum. And the only reason why you can see that, you'll see a rock with a black patina, and if it has a blue ring around its outer edge, it's that particular species.
ah, fascinating. Have time for one more question, but I do want to note for participants that we're recording this session, and on the Keep Sedona Beautiful website, under speaker series, if you'd like to look at this again or go to the end of it for the references or anything, it will be made available to folks on our website. Usually takes about a day for it to get up there. And last question is, do we know if any lichens are keystone species where the ecosystem would suffer significantly if the lichens were removed?
Well, if you start losing lichens in areas where they normally grow, that's an indicator that something's going wrong, ecologically. And again, they are vital in such, causing the soil to stay where it is. They give nutrients to the soil, nitrogen to the soil, and really just enriching the soil for other plants to grow in a successional way. And again, the worst thing that can happen is these different organisms die. And all of a sudden, then you don't have that richness of soil anymore. And that's why I'm saying, once you step on the pinnacle and crush it, it'll take over 100 years to reform if it's never touched again. So.
Great. So a key message on that is, as we always say around here, stay on the trails.
That's right.
Be a good hiker, biker, and protect the lichen. Well, thank you, Garry. This has been a fascinating presentation. I know 10 times more about lichen now than I ever thought I would. Thank you so much for the presentation. And thank you to everyone who joined in on us. We hope you join our next one next month. Thanks a lot, everyone.